Welcome to the DisabiliTEA, a podcast where we have candid discussions about all things related to disability. Short-term, long-term, financial claims, impact on other areas of life, causes in the workplace, and more. With your host, attorney Anjel Burgess. You can find this show at www.disabilityhelpline.com and on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now here's the host of the DisabiliTEA, Anjel Burgess.
Hello and welcome to the DisabiliTEA. Today we are so excited to have with us Claire Wylds Wright, who is the CEO of the Hypersomnia Foundation. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you. It's always good to see you, Anjel. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Absolutely. Well, I want to just dive right in. You've got so much great information to share with our audience. So if we can start off by having you explain, what is the Hypersomnia Foundation?
Yeah, so the Hypersomnia Foundation is a registered non-profit 501c3 organization that's based in the US but has a global reach. And we strive to provide programs, events, and connection and support for people struggling with idiopathic hypersomnia and their supporters. So that's what we do in a nutshell. The other piece actually that's probably relevant to this conversation is that we raise money for research. Because that's such a priority for us to advance the research space and the disease understanding for idiopathic hypersomnia with a view to really supporting people to get access to medication that will help their condition.
Okay. Now, what is idiopathic hypersomnia?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's such a strange word, and yet it is a sleep disorder that affects a lot of people who have experienced real struggles with sleep over the years and then gone through kind of standard sleep testing and have finally, hopefully, arrived at a sleep diagnosis. But the symptoms that prevail are ones much of excessive, extreme sleepiness, both through the night and through the day. And it's specifically characterized by the fact that when people with idiopathic hypersomnia do sleep, they do not wake up rested at all. So it's an extremely frustrating and complex condition, and it has massive impact on every aspect of their lives. It's a 24-hour disorder that means people with idiopathic hypersomnia really struggle in everyday activities of living. It impacts everything from relationships to work opportunities, to studying, to driving, to just really everything that we take for granted as people that do not have a sleep disorder. So it's a poorly understood condition, not super well researched, certainly not super well funded, but one that is pretty disabling for many people that unfortunately end up with this diagnosis.
Interesting. So I know that a lot of people, when they hear the terms sleep disorder, most people, if you ask, they would probably say, well, I don't really know what that is, but I have heard of narcolepsy.
Yeah.
So how is idiopathic hypersomnia different than narcolepsy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think narcolepsy sort of traditionally been like the big sister to idiopathic hypersomnia, and in some ways, which is quite unfortunate, IH has been somewhat in the shadows because there's some very distinctive differences. The one that most comes to mind is that people with type 1 narcolepsy have a symptom called cataplexy. And this is where people with type 1 narcolepsy experience a specific emotion like joy, and then experience a partial body paralysis for some moments. So people with IH do not have cataplexy. Having said that, they are still extremely impacted by what we call excessive daytime sleeping and disturbed nighttime sleep, the ability to sustain restful sleep at night. So there are some overlaps. and there are some distinctions. There's also a broader conversation around type 2 narcolepsy, which doesn't have cataplexy, stay with me, and the relationship between what we call NT2, type 2 narcolepsy, and idiopathic hypersomnia. There's more overlap there. It does sound a little bit complicated, but sort of for people that are struggling with IH or NT2, there's a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities. And so these are the things that people with either NT2 or IH, or indeed NT1, can certainly, you know, thrash out in the doctor's office to really understand that distinction and hopefully arrive at the accurate diagnosis that, you know, that they need.
Okay. So with any sleep disorder, you know, whether it's idiopathic hypersomnia, whether it's narcolepsy type 1 or 2, and I know that there are some other types of sleep disorders, what would you say that, you know, someone that's watching or listening, you know, what are some of these signs, or what are some of the things that they may experience that should alert them to the fact that, hey, you need to talk to your doctor about what's going on?
That's a really good question, because I think we all need to sleep, and we all justify excessive sleepiness. You know, certainly when my daughter was going through a similar journey, for a few months, I was like, well, she's had a cold and she's had these various other aspects affect her life. And, you know, we hear it time and time again, you know, for teenagers and young adults, you know, well, they're burning the candle at both ends. And so, you know, we justify our sleepiness. But I think the distinction is when it really consistently impacts your activities of daily living. So, you know, we typically hear of people falling asleep at the wheel, falling asleep in class, this irresistible and uncontrollable urge to sleep. And just for people, you know, our listeners here, to be very aware that there's a distinct difference there. You know, we all experience sleepiness sometimes, might need a nap sometimes, but people with a sleep disorder have an uncontrollable and intractable urge to sleep. It's completely unavoidable.
Okay.
And it impacts pretty much every aspect of their lives. And more commonly, actually, Anjel, I should say that it's a really good practice for us to listen to people that are coming alongside us to sort of point out, you know, this isn't normal. So sometimes it honestly takes someone else to like point these things out to those that have potentially a sleep diagnosis.
And so for people that are, you know, listening or watching and they're saying, hey, that sounds like me, that sounds like what I've been dealing with. I would imagine with sleep disorders, because they are not as well known, you know, because they're so rare, is it hard to find a doctor that won't just dismiss the symptoms that you go to and say, hey, I'm sleeping way too much, I know this is not normal? Is it difficult to find a doctor that knows anything about IH or any other sleep disorder?
You've hit on something that's really important, and that is how, you know, many people would even maybe bring this up with their primary healthcare physician, and actually even at that point it be excused, or typically, you know, it's attributed to depression, various important life events, maybe even psychiatric conditions. So this is what we call in the space as a delayed diagnosis, and this is extremely common. Some people with a sleep disorder have a really difficult journey towards diagnosis. And then once they get a diagnosis, they say, well, actually, my symptoms started 5 or 10 years ago. Wow. So this is very, very common. But as individuals advocating for ourselves in these contexts, it's important that we ask to either see a sleep specialist. Sometimes it's a pulmonologist. There's many routes to a diagnosis, but essentially, people need to land with having sleep studies that will confirm whether or not they indeed have a sleep disorder.
And the Hypersomnia Foundation sounds like, and I know from personal experience, is a great resource for anyone that may be having symptoms that just has some questions, that wants to find a community
Right.
of like-minded or like experience or lived experience individuals. Can you tell us how a person could get in touch with, or get some information from the Hypersomnia Foundation?
Yeah, so the obvious place to start is to go to our website, which is www.hypersomniafoundation.org. It's a really pretty dense website in terms of information, but we also have an info at email. So we'll always respond to inquiries, and we can point people in the right direction. So there are numerous directories of physicians and resources that we can point people towards. So there's definitely help out there, but it can be a little bit difficult to access, because I'm not sure, and this is our challenge around the terminology with idiopathic hypersomnia, someone who's excessively sleeping and concerned that this isn't normal and maybe needing to start that journey towards a diagnosis. They're not going to Google idiopathic hypersomnia necessarily. So this is a real challenge to us, but for the sake of the audience here, our website is a good resource. So I would start there for sure.
And as far as the organization is concerned, besides the website, which has a wealth of information on it, are there any events or workshops or any other mediums that people can use to get more information?
Yeah, so we have a YouTube channel with a really good bank of educational content. So again, you can just type in YouTube Hypersomnia Foundation and access those for educational purposes. But also we run Unite program, which is once a month. It's an educational / support group where people can, it's for free, just join us on Zoom. It's online. We often have key speakers that will present various topics around living with IH. So it could be about work accommodations, it could be about relationships, it could be about a word that we use a lot called comorbidities, which is just kind of like further downstream the impact of the condition that has more systemically on our health. So that's the Unite program. And again, people can find this on our website. But we have in-person and live events as well upcoming. Conference in June in Indianapolis. That's June 2nd to the 4th. So we love to see people. We have wonderful speakers that bring us up to speed on research, and there's a really diverse content there actually that addresses all the aspects that are so challenging to live with a sleep disorder. And yeah, we have quite a few things coming up this year, including a new TikTok channel. So, hold that space for that upcoming event. But you can find us on social media. That's always good for keeping track of where we're at as an organization and what we're doing to serve our community.
Excellent. Well, it's great to know that there are organizations like the Hypersomnia Foundation out there to help people that are dealing with sleep issues. I know that from personal experience, I see the word hypersomnia tossed around a lot in medical records. And usually doesn't say idiopathic hypersomnia, but it says hypersomnia. So a lot of times when I see that, I think, well, this person has reported issues with excessive sleepiness to the doctor, and it sounds like it's just kind of been kind of put to the side and said, okay, you've got hypersomnia, but there oftentimes doesn't seem to be any follow-up behind that.
Right.
So that sounds like a lot of the experiences that you've described that most people have.
Yeah, and I think that puts more of a burden on the person, on the patient, which is unfortunate because when you're that sleepy and that impacted by lack of quality sleep, it's really hard to then self-advocate, right? So this is why we need foundations like Hypersomnia Foundation and organizations that will kind of bridge that gap between the individual experience and being advocates actually. So it's a huge burden for people or even caregivers to kind of fill in all those spaces, which we sort of assume and expect the physicians to do. But I think sleep health, although it's emerging in terms of an understanding, certainly from a clinical perspective, historically it's been really lacking and not taking that seriously. And it's only more recently with the World Health Organization actually establishing it as one of the pillars for health, alongside others like diet and exercise, which is so obvious. And in a way, it's surprising, isn't it, that sleep hasn't been registered as a pillar of health before now. But I think things are shifting, and we're trying to destigmatize very much, the fact that people with a sleep disorder are excessively sleeping and need certain things or accommodations, whether that's just in everyday life or in the workplace, to actually cope. So it's quite an emerging and exciting space at the moment, not just because it's becoming more front and center of basic health, particularly sleep health, but also because there's new medications that are coming out to really support people that are struggling.
And you actually bring me to my next question, Claire. I wanted to ask about treatment and a cure, because those are usually some of the first questions that people will ask. Okay, I've got a diagnosis. Is there a cure, or what is the treatment for it?
Yeah, I relate to that actually, because when my daughter was first diagnosed when she was 3, that was my first question. I pretty much established this wasn't life-threatening, but then straight away also realized that this was lifelong and incurable. So at the moment, idiopathic hypersomnia and type 1 or type 2 narcolepsy is incurable and lifelong and is a chronic disease. But there are treatments, and some are very, very effective. It often takes quite a lot of tweaking, or sometimes a bit of a cocktail, a bit of a mix between stimulants in the day to help people stay awake and medications at night to help people sustain sleep. So it is a difficult diagnostic journey. Once people arrive at a diagnosis, there are options, but there could be more. Is there a cure? I'm probably not the best person to ask that. I mean, as a parent, I'm hopeful for that. But realistically, I think it's a bit of a stretch at the moment. Having said that, that's certainly the desire in the research space. But that means better disease understanding before it means, coming up with a cure. I think what's more realistic is a medication that will reverse symptoms. So currently, the medications will address 1 or 2 symptoms, which is very significant and helpful. However, there's more in the pipeline, various companies that are hoping to develop a medication that will address multiple symptoms. So this is where we get a bit excited and hopeful as a community. I think that's realistic. I think that's much more realistic than coming out of the gate and saying, well, there's going to be a cure in 30 years. I mean, I'd love that, but I think it's important to be realistic too.
Well, it's interesting that, with your role as the CEO of the Hypersomnia Foundation, you have also mentioned that you have a personal connection to sleep disorders. So do you want to share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, I always love talking about my kids. So I have 3 children, actually, Liberty, Elliot, and Matilda. And in 2010, Matilda had the H1N1 vaccine in the UK. Okay. And prior to that, she was quite healthy. But after the vaccine, she developed type 1 narcolepsy. And at the time she was diagnosed, it was quite a difficult diagnostic journey in some ways, but in other ways, it was quite quick. So it only took 6 months. She was 3.5 at the time when she received a diagnosis. And we know that it takes typically much, much longer, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years for most people. But a pediatric onset is often an abrupt onset, and her symptoms were very striking. So she received a diagnosis of type 1 narcolepsy in the summer of 2010. And then we moved from the UK to California to get treatment at Stanford, which is the world leading center for narcolepsy research, specifically under a doctor called Emmanuel Mignot. And for the next 10, 12 years, she's received treatment there, which has been centered on really addressing some of her symptoms, but also the impact of her condition on other aspects of her life, like her education, socialization, mood, general health, like, exercise, diet, and so on and so forth. So I do have a personal passion behind this, which is really the story there was my own journey through navigating Matilda's diagnosis and that search for treatment. And for our family, that actually meant moving countries. I don't really wish that on anyone, but we love being here and so grateful for the American healthcare system, however complex that is, which it is. I've had to navigate all sorts of aspects of health insurance, and even at the moment I don't have any. So it's been very humbling actually to try and understand a different healthcare system from different perspectives. But I would say this, that in the UK, treatment for her at the time was not available at all. So it was like a toss up between, well, do we just stay and she doesn't get treatment for the next 6 years, lose her childhood, or really try and find a way to fund it in the States. So it's very complicated. There's no perfect route to it. It's, as you know, Anjel, with your work, you're always supporting people that are struggling to access medication or funds that they need with disability to, like, at least get into a level playing field. So it does motivate me, being a parent and a caregiver of a now 16-year-old with narcolepsy. And I'm really grateful for, being able to have that voice, because her story, it does sound really dramatic. But on the other hand, it's a shared story. And so it's not actually unique. And neither is mine as a caregiver. I mean, one of the privileges of being in this role and as an advocate for the last sort of 5 to 10 years is that I meet people every week who have really almost the same story. So I count that as a real privilege to be able to journey with them and hopefully be able to shed a little bit of light, because there is hope, right? There is hope.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really admire and appreciate about the Hypersomnia Foundation is something that you touched on, Claire, is, there is the experience from, the patient, from the individual that's actually dealing with the disorder. And then there's the caregiver, right? Yeah. And the caregiver or caregivers need support.
Yeah.
And I know that with the Hypersomnia Foundation that there is a lot of emphasis on that as well, as, hey, let's not just, let's not forget the caregiver and
right.
the caregivers, because they also need support and a community. And I'm sure that you've personally found that to be very helpful.
Yeah, I think in some ways, and I was actually writing about this yesterday, because I think siblings also, they're unsung heroes, because, any person with a diagnosis, and certainly I felt this right from the get-go, that it was a family's diagnosis. And whilst Matilda was obviously the focal point of moving towards health, we had to bring everyone into that as well, because everyone's impacted severely. So you're right to point out that the Hypersomnia Foundation has that focus. And for example, at our conferences, we run sessions on what it's like to be a caregiver or supporter. And in fact, it's really, really helpful when, as caregivers and supporters, we meet each other, because our experience is unique also.
Right.
So, I think there's an analogy about, I think that's that one on the airplane. If you run out of oxygen, you've got to put your own mask on first, haven't you, before you someone else. And with that in mind, and I can relate to it, because it's very natural actually to put everyone else first. But I think you have to really think hard about self-care so that you can be the best kind of supporter possible for that person in your life.
Absolutely. So you also wear other hats besides being a CEO, besides being a mom and a caregiver and an advocate. Tell us about some of the other hats that you wear.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually set up a 501c3 called Sleep Consortium with my colleague Lindsay Jedstadt. And this is fairly new. It feels like a sort of a toddler learning to walk at the moment. But it's focused on research and sharing patient consented data. So one of the things that's really concerned us, both Lindsay and I, over the last 5 to 10 years as advocates, is how patients' data is not owned by the patient. In fact, not even particularly known where their data is shared. So we have an opportunity within this organisation to create a database that patients can upload their information. And in fact, we can pull registries in as well and large data sets, and interconnect it with other disease spaces. So this is where we can identify patients, say, who may have come in the platform through another disease area like Parkinson's or epilepsy or Prader-Willi, et cetera, and actually fill out the sleep survey and then be identified as someone also with a sleep disorder. And it's quite important, this work, because not only do people have the opportunity to get a quicker diagnosis and quicker access to treatment, but I think it sheds light on an understanding that, a lot of people don't just have one diagnosis, and life is very complicated. And when you're siloed specifically with one disease area, everything else is ignored. So we're very cognizant of that. We've had a lot of people approach us from other disease spaces saying, well, our primary diagnosis is X, but we're experiencing all these sleep disorder symptoms. So that's very exciting for Sleep Consortium, for sure. It gives us a lot of opportunities also to get in front of the FDA and accelerate access to new medications for people. So watch this space. We're about to launch in the next sort of 4 to 6 months. It's been a bit of a heavy lift, actually, in the last 2 years, because it's so new. The concept is so new. And I should add that the data that is uploaded onto the platform is analysed by AI and machine learning, and governed by the Broad Institute and MIT. So it's not a new concept, particularly in disease areas, to analyse data using AI and machine learning, but it's not been done in sleep. And that's why we set up Sleep Consortium.
I think that, with your involvement and the things that you've shared with us today, Claire, to me, what comes to mind is, something that I think people forget a lot about when they're dealing with any disorder, right? Is that when we're talking about treatment and, getting medication or whatever it may be, research is critical, right? Research is what helps, medications to be created. And, so research is so important. And I think that research is probably an area where there could be some more participation in clinical trials and things like that to help further, advances in treating disorders like sleep disorders, like idiopathic hypersomnia. So is that something that you also see in your role of CEO, that there's not as much involvement in clinical trials as is desired?
That's a good question. Also, I think from a hypersomnia, we always promote clinical trials at the Hypersomnia Foundation, and we work with organisations and companies that want to put out, the parameters around clinical trials, and that's a pretty straightforward process, actually. One of the benefits on the platform, this is now switching back to Sleep Consortium, is that we can run the parameters of a clinical trial through the platform, and it will identify patients immediately, and then they'll receive notification that you're a good fit for this clinical trial. So if you want to do it, here's how that should happen. So I think there is a focus for both organizations to accelerate clinical trials, and our relationship with pharmaceutical companies is really good. I think Hypersomnia Foundation, both organizations are very well respected, and have, a history of being kind of trustworthy, actually, as the interface between sometimes those organizations and the patient community. So we're extremely committed to accelerating clinical trials because exactly what you said, that without that participation, research is going to be slow, which essentially means so is access to medication. And without the cure, as we mentioned, without that, then at least we want people to have better medications, to have that help that they need to get through each day and night. It's really critical. So our commitment lies squarely, as you rightly mentioned, with clinical trials. It's just a pivotal process that we're committed to, both organizations.
Outstanding. So is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience that we have not discussed, that you want people to, kind of walk away from either watching or listening this episode as it relates to sleep disorders, hypersomnia, or anything?
Yeah, I think I would say, one of the things that I experience and I've seen over and over again is to doubt yourself sometimes. And, you need to really trust your gut, whether that's for yourself or for someone you care for. When something feels off, do the research. There's plenty of resources that are free online, clue up on all of that and be confident in going to the doctor's office. And sometimes this means people in our community see 2, 3, 4 doctors before they get any answers. And, think of all the people that have kind of dropped off because they're like, oh, well, trust the doctor. So there is a rise in the patient voice, actually, as advocates collectively and individually. And I would encourage people to really hold on to that and to be their own advocates, because that's the only way they're going to get their answers. So sometimes that means you need to trust your gut and stick your neck out a little bit, even if it's really difficult. And if you can't do that, then have someone do it with you or for you.
Absolutely. Well, those are great words for everyone to just, really think about and to kind of motivate those who may be a little less likely to advocate for themselves. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claire, for being here, for sharing with us about all of the great work that you do. And this has been another episode of the DisabiliTEA. We've enjoyed spending time with you, and we look forward to talking with you next time.
Thank you. And thank you for all you do. I know that I've referred some people in our community to you. Yeah, it's amazing what you do to help people that are really vulnerable and struggling. And I'm glad we can kind of partner in that way. Dream team. Thank you for having me.
That's right. Thanks so much, Claire.
You've been listening to the DisabiliTEA with Anjel Burgess. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others. You can catch prior episodes at www.disabilityhelpline.com and on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.